What's your best, we'd love to stay, but excuse to leave an event? Story 1. I once had to escape a family reunion that I really wasn't feeling. It had been a long day, and I was just looking for a way out. My aunt had been going on and on about her latest knitting project, and I couldn't find the energy to keep up the charade. As I was mentally checking out, my cousin started talking about how long it had been since we played a family board game. I saw my opportunity. I raised my hand and said, I'd love to stay, but I promised my neighbor I'd help him assemble his new bookshelf. He's been struggling with it for days, and I can't leave him hanging. Everyone bought it. I rushed out the door and spent the rest of the evening binging Netflix at home. Sometimes, you've just got to fake a good deed to save your sanity. Story 2. A few months ago, I went to a birthday party that, from the moment I walked in, felt like I had stepped into a time warp. It was full of people I barely knew, and the conversation revolved around things I couldn't relate to at all. I was ready to leave, but I couldn't figure out how to do it without seeming rude. Then I overheard a conversation about a surprise guest coming. Seizing the moment, I stood up and said, I'd love to stay, but I just realized I have to pick up my brother from the airport. He's flying in from a business trip, and I promised I'd be there. Everyone seemed perfectly fine with it, and I bolted out of there, feeling a little guilty but mostly relieved. I didn't even have a brother. It felt a little bad lying, but the alternative was staying in an awkward social situation for hours. Story 3. One time, I went to a work holiday party that was definitely not my scene. People from all departments were there, and despite the fancy venue and free drinks, I could tell right away this wasn't going to be a night to remember. It was all small talk and forced laughter. I decided to make my exit early, but I didn't want to be too obvious. So I found a quiet spot in the corner, took out my phone, and pretended to check email. I quickly texted my friend, Hey, I think I forgot to lock my car. I'm just going to run outside and check real quick. Call me if you need me. I walked out of the venue, got in my car, and drove to a nearby coffee shop. Spent the next couple of hours sipping on a latte and catching up on my favorite YouTube channels. The relief was so worth it. Story 4. One of my college roommates invited me to a party at his new apartment. I had no idea what to expect, but I showed up to find a bunch of people I didn't know, and the vibe was off from the beginning. No one seemed to be interacting, and it just felt like one of those, we're here because we have to be kind of events. After about 30 minutes of standing awkwardly by the snack table, I came up with my plan. I walked over to my roommate, looked concerned, and said, I'd love to stay, but my dog's been acting weird. I think she might have eaten something she shouldn't have. I could see the panic in his eyes, so he waved me off, telling me to take care of it. I rushed out, called a friend on the way to my car to make it sound real, and went home to binge watch a series. No dogs were harmed in the making of my excuse, by the way. Story 5. A friend invited me to a housewarming party, and honestly, I was just not in the mood. The invitation seemed like a desperate attempt to fill the space, and I could already sense that the evening would be filled with people I didn't know and awkward silences. I didn't want to disappoint, so I went, thinking I'd at least stay for a drink. It didn't take long for me to realize I was right. I was standing alone by the punch bowl when my phone buzzed. It was my mom. Your aunt's not feeling well. She needs you to call her. You should check on her. I thought, perfect. I quickly called out, I'd love to stay, but I just got a text from my mom and it sounds urgent. I really need to go check on my aunt. No one argued with that excuse. I threw on my coat, stepped outside, and drove around the block to grab some fast food. Sometimes, saving yourself from social fatigue requires a good, swift escape. Story 6. A few years ago, I was invited to a dinner party by a friend. I knew a couple of the people attending, but the rest were strangers. It started off okay, but after the first hour, I realized that everyone was just talking about things I had no interest. It was one of those situations where everyone else had a connection, and I was left out of the conversation. Everyone was deep into discussions about their kids' school activities or recent vacation spots, and I had nothing to contribute. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to seem rude or just disappear. So I came up with what I thought was a genius excuse. I stood up and said, I'd love to stay, but I just got a call from my aunt. She's in the hospital, and I think I should go check on her. It's nothing major, but I should probably go. I had no idea if my aunt was actually sick. In fact, I didn't even have an aunt who was in the hospital, but the lie sounded convincing enough that people quickly nodded and said they hoped she was okay. I grabbed my coat, and as soon as I stepped out of the door, I called my friend and told him I'd meet him at a bar. We spent the next couple of hours swapping hilarious stories about awkward social situations, and I was grateful to be out of that uncomfortable dinner. Story 7. It was a random Saturday night when my college roommate invited me to one of his high school friends' house parties. I wasn't exactly thrilled because I had a ton of work to do for an upcoming exam, but trying to be a good sport, I agreed to go for just an hour or so. I got there, and things were not what I expected. There was loud music blasting, everyone was already tipsy, and no one seemed to care about anything outside of their own little cliques. I stood around for a bit, sipping a drink, hoping the night would turn around, but it didn't. It got worse. People were playing a game that I didn't know, and it felt like an inside joke that I wasn't a part of. I started texting my friend under the table, telling him that I needed a way out. It didn't take long before my phone buzzed. I saw the perfect excuse. Just got a call. My dog's sick. I need to take her to the vet. I didn't even have a dog, but it didn't matter. I excused myself and told everyone I had to run home. As soon as I was out of sight, I made a beeline for the nearest coffee shop and spent the rest of the night reading a book. Honestly, I don't regret it. Story 8. There's always that one friend who organizes an event that's too much. My friend Carl threw a huge, casual BBQ at his place once, and of course I had to attend. At first, everything was cool. There was music, food, and drinks. But after a few hours, I realized it was becoming less of a BBQ and more of an impromptu party. People were getting loud, and I could tell this wasn't going to be the laid-back evening I had anticipated. Carl kept pushing shots on people, and suddenly it felt like I was trapped in the middle of an intense college frat party. I didn't want to be rude, so I went along with it for as long as I could, but eventually I had to get out. The moment I saw an opening, I approached Carl and said, "Hey man, I'd love to stay, but my roommate is dealing with some car trouble and I promised I'd help him out. I better go see what's going on." That was all it took. Carl was pretty understanding about it, and I was able to escape the chaos without any drama. I ended up spending the rest of the evening at home with some snacks and my favorite show. Story 9. One of the worst places to be is stuck at an event where everyone is cliqué. I attended a networking event for my job a while ago, and to put it mildly, it was the most awkward gathering I've ever been to. The first few minutes weren't bad, but as the evening wore on, it felt like everyone was just trying to one-up each other with their business success story. Everyone was talking about their promotion or their latest project, and it felt like I had nothing to contribute. I could feel my social battery draining. I kept glancing at my phone, hoping for a good excuse to leave, but no texts came through. Finally, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I spotted a group of people talking in the corner about their dogs. For some reason, this was the only conversation that seemed semi-normal. I walked over and said, "I'd love to stay, but my dog's been having some serious stomach issues. I think I need to get home and keep an eye on her." That did the trick. Everyone immediately said their sympathies and encouraged me to take care of my sick dog. I was out of there in no time, and I didn't feel 1 ounce of guilt. I walked to the nearest cafe and spent the rest of the night just relaxing and enjoying the peace. Story 10. I went to a friend's wedding last year, and let me tell you, it was the most extravagant affair I've ever attended. The venue was beautiful, the food was fancy, and the speeches went on and on. Everything about the wedding was perfect, except for the fact that I was so bored that I could barely keep my eyes open. It was one of those events where you sit at a table full of people you don't know, trying to make small talk, but nothing connects. I tried to make the best of it, but after hours of speeches and endless rounds of hors d'oeuvre, I knew I had to leave. I pulled out my phone and pretended to get a message. I stood up, cleared my throat, and said, "I'd love to stay, but I've just gotten a message from my boss. There's a work emergency, and I need to go back to the office to handle it." It was such a perfect excuse, and everyone believed. They said goodbye, and I headed straight for the exit. I didn't even care that I didn't stay for the cake cutting. I was free. As soon as I got into my car, I went home, threw on some comfy clothes, and indulged in a much-needed Netflix marathon. Story 11. It was a Friday evening, and I had just wrapped up a long week of work when my college roommate invited me to a housewarming party at his friend's place. Normally, I'd be all in for hanging out, but I was exhausted, and the thought of socializing after such a grueling week seemed unbearable. However, not wanting to look like a party pooper, I reluctantly agreed. The party itself wasn't bad at first. There were a few familiar faces, the drinks were flowing, and the music wasn't too loud. But after about an hour, things started to shift. It was getting crowded, and everyone was getting a bit too rowdy for my liking. People started shouting over each other, playing beer pong, and even setting up a karaoke machine in the corner. The noise was unbearable, and I could feel my patience slipping away. I knew I had to make my exit, but I didn't want to be rude. As I was thinking about how to leave without causing any fuss, I overheard someone talking about a friend's dog who had eaten an entire pizza. In that moment, I had a light bulb moment. I walked up to my roommate and said, "I'd love to stay, but I just got a call from my mom. Apparently, my dog ate something she shouldn't have. She's acting really strange, and I think I should go check on her." My roommate gave me an understanding look and assured me that I could leave if I needed to. I made my way to the door, got into my car, and drove around the block to grab a coffee. The rest of the night was spent in peace, with no obnoxious karaoke or rambunctious guests. It felt like the greatest escape. Story 12. A couple of months ago, I got invited to a friend's birthday party. It sounded great in theory. Good food, good company, and the promise of fun. However, the moment I stepped into the house, I realized this wasn't going to be the kind of evening I had imagined. People were standing around in tight circles, laughing awkwardly, and no one seemed to know how to start a conversation. It was the classic, too many strangers, not enough social skills situation. I tried my best to participate, but after what felt like hours of nodding and smiling while I secretly checked the time, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed an out. I spotted my friend by the kitchen and seized the opportunity. I said, "Hey, I'd love to stay, but I just got a message from my sister. She's having a meltdown over something that happened at work, and I promised I'd help her out. I should probably go check in on her." My friend nodded in understanding, and I bolted for the door. I didn't even say goodbye to anyone else. The moment I was outside, I sighed with relief and texted my sister, "Hey, I'm on my way. Just need to grab a snack first." I ended up spending the rest of the night binge watching my favorite series in complete solitude. Honestly, it was the best part of my week. Story 13. I've been to my fair share of weddings, but there was one in particular that I couldn't get out of fast enough. It was a family wedding, and let me tell you, family weddings are their own special brand of torture. Between the awkward small talk with distant relatives and the never-ending speeches that felt like they were being dragged out for no reason, I quickly realized that this wasn't going to be the fun wedding I had hoped for. The ceremony itself had been nice, but once the reception started, it was clear that I was over it. People were getting drunk and loud, the music was too loud, and it felt like every single person at my table was talking about their best vacation or the latest family gossip. It was overwhelming. I started thinking of ways to escape. Then it hit me. I could pretend to have an urgent work emergency. I pulled out my phone, pretended to check a message, and then excused myself. "I'd love to stay, but I just got a work email that needs an immediate response. I promised I'd take care of it tonight," I said, in what I hoped was a convincing tone. Everyone seemed sympathetic, and without hesitation, I headed out the door. I didn't even take my coat off before I jumped into my car and drove to the nearest coffee shop. The rest of the evening was spent sipping on a warm latte and catching up on some much-needed alone time. It was the most peaceful part of the day. Story 14. I'm usually up for anything, but when I was invited to a so-called casual hangout at a friend's house, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. It started off innocently enough, but as the night went on, I began to realize that the gathering was anything but casual. People were taking turns telling stories that went on for what felt like hours, and there was an uncomfortable amount of pressure to participate in every conversation, whether I had anything to say or not. As the night dragged on, I started to feel like I was suffocating. I couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to find a way out, but I didn't want to seem rude. That's when I remembered that my neighbor had mentioned earlier in the week that he was getting a new fridge delivered and that he needed help setting it up. Without wasting a second, I walked over to the host and said, "I'd love to stay, but I just remembered that I promised my neighbor I'd help him with his new fridge. He's expecting me, and I really can't let him down." The host was understanding and told me not to worry about it. I made my exit, drove to the nearest store to get a snack, and spent the rest of the night at home, cozy on the couch. The fridge setting up thing? Total lie, but it worked like a charm. Story 15. It was a Saturday evening when my friend invited me to his low-key get-together at his apartment. I assumed it would be a chill evening with a few people, but I quickly realized I was mistaken. When I walked in, I was hit with the overpowering smell of incense and the sound of people talking about their spiritual journeys and universal energies. Everyone was sitting in a circle, and someone had brought out a crystal ball. I wasn't prepared for this level of New Age energy. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate the vibe, but this was just way too much for me. I tried to engage for a bit, but the conversation quickly veered into topics that made me uncomfortable, and the room was getting hotter by the second. I couldn't handle it any longer, so I decided to make my exit. I excused myself by saying, "I'd love to stay, but I just realized I have a call I need to take. It's an old friend, and we've been trying to reconnect." Everyone nodded in understanding, and I made my way out. As soon as I was outside, I called a friend and said, "Hey, you free for a movie night? I need to escape from this place." The rest of the evening was spent with pizza and laughter, far away from any talk of energies or crystals. Story 16. A few weeks ago, I was invited to a brunch gathering that seemed harmless. The host, a friend of a friend, was one of those people who always has something interesting going on in their life, so I figured I'd give it a shot. But when I arrived, I immediately realized I had made a mistake. The group was small but way more intimate than I was comfortable with. People were sitting around in a circle, discussing things like their spiritual awakenings and the latest meditation retreats they'd been to. Honestly, it felt like an infomercial for New Age philosophy. I had barely enough time to grab a mimosa before the conversation turned to organic teas and detox diets. After about an hour, I was completely over it. My stomach was growling from the lack of real food, and I had nothing to contribute to the conversation. I looked at the clock, trying to figure out how I could gracefully exit. That's when it happened. The host turned to me and asked, "So, what's been going on in your life lately?" I panicked for a moment, and then I had an idea. "I'd love to stay," I said, "but I just remembered that I promised to help my cousin move into her new place. I totally forgot it was today, and I really should go. I'm sorry." Everyone nodded sympathetically and offered to help if I wanted, but I told them I'd be fine. I grabbed my things and quickly slipped out the door. The moment I was in my car, I sent a quick text to a friend saying, "Let's grab lunch." And that's how I spent the rest of the day. At a delicious diner, enjoying a cheeseburger, far away from those organic teas. Story 17. A few months ago, I went to a friend's housewarming party. He had recently moved to a new place, and I was excited to see the new digs. But what I didn't realize was that he had invited a lot of people I didn't know, and everyone seemed to have the same loud, overly energetic vibe. It wasn't so much a party as it was a competition to see who could talk the loudest and funniest. As much as I tried to fit in, I could barely hear myself think. The whole thing felt like an extrovert's dream and an introvert's nightmare. I found myself standing in the corner, clutching a plastic cup, hoping for some miracle that would allow me to gracefully slip away. But no such luck. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I caught sight of a friend from college. I hadn't seen him in years, so I went over to say hi. After a couple of awkward sentences, he mentioned how he was about to leave. That was the sign I needed. "I'd love to stay, but I just got a call from my sister," I said, "and she needs me to help her with something at her place. She's not feeling well, and I promised I'd be there." My friend looked concerned and said to go ahead. I quickly said my goodbyes to the host, who didn't seem to mind at all, and I was out the door. As soon as I was in the car, I texted another friend and told her I was heading to a quiet bar. The rest of the evening was spent in peace, far from the chaos of that party. Story 18. I never thought I'd find myself at a yoga retreat, but there I was, sitting in a room full of people with mats and candles. It wasn't my idea to go. I had been dragged along by a friend who swore that it would be a life-changing experience. At first, it seemed like a relaxing break, but as the hours dragged on, I began to realize this wasn't quite the Zen experience I'd imagined. Everyone was sitting cross-legged, chanting mantras, and talking about the vibration of the universe. I just wanted to stretch and call it a day. But the whole thing started to feel like a cult meet. The instructor had a calm but commanding voice, and I could feel the group's collective energy rising to some spiritual level that I couldn't comprehend. After 2 hours of deep breathing, I realized I was done. My stomach was growling, and I needed some real food. As the instructor asked us to lie down for another round of breathing exercises, I decided to bail. I raised my hand and said, "I'd love to stay, but I just realized I forgot about a very important call with my boss. It's about a project I've been working on, and I really can't miss it." The instructor nodded and told me not to worry. I quietly grabbed my things, slipped out of the room, and walked straight to the nearest cafe. There, I enjoyed a sandwich and some coffee, feeling infinitely better than I had inside that room. Story 19. I went to a book club meeting last week, hoping to enjoy some conversation about literature, but as soon as I walked into the house, I knew something was off. The room was filled with people who were much more passionate about their personal political opinions than the books we were supposed to be discussing. It wasn't even so. Every conversation seemed to quickly spiral into debates about current events, and I felt like I was stuck in the middle of a never-ending argument. I had barely started my drink when someone asked me for my opinion on a controversial topic, and before I could answer, someone else chimed in with their thoughts. It was exhausting. I tried to steer the conversation back to the book we were supposed to be discussing, but it didn't work. Finally, I had enough. I turned to the host and said, "I'd love to stay, but I just got a text from my neighbor. There's an emergency at my place, and I really need to run home." The host was understanding and told me to go ahead. I grabbed my jacket, made a beeline for the door, and felt an immediate sense of relief as soon as I stepped outside. I spent the rest of the evening at home with a cup of tea and a good book, exactly how I had originally planned. Story 20. I was invited to a dinner party by a friend I hadn't seen in a while. At first, it sounded like a great idea, catching up, eating good food, and having some light conversation. But when I walked into her apartment, I was hit by the smell of intense incense, and the music was a bit too loud for my taste. It felt like a rave, but with fewer people and more homemade pasta. As the night wore on, it became clear that this wasn't just a casual dinner party. People were talking about their life goals, the latest self-help books they were reading, and how they were all manifesting their best lives. I tried to stay engaged, but honestly, I was just exhausted and wanted to go home. That's when my moment arrived. I got a text from my roommate asking if I was coming home soon because she'd accidentally left the oven on. Now, I knew that was probably not true, but it was the perfect excuse. I'd love to stay, but I just got a text from my roommate. She left the oven on, and I really need to go home to make sure everything's okay. Everyone was understanding, and I was free to go. I walked out into the cool night air, grabbed a slice of pizza on my way home, and spent the rest of the evening relaxing. It turned out to be the perfect escape from an event that was definitely not for me. Story 21. A few weeks ago, I was invited to a casual get-together at a friend's apartment. She had been talking about this party for a while, and I was curious, so I figured I'd pop in for an hour or two. It sounded simple enough, just a few drinks and some small talk with people I hadn't seen in a while. However, as soon as I stepped through the door, I realized It was not as casual as promised. The place was packed with strangers, and the music was blaring. People were clustered in tight groups, and there was a lot of laughing, shouting, and the occasional spill of a drink. I tried to mingle, but every conversation I attempted felt forced. Everyone seemed to know each other already, and I felt like an outsider. I spent more time trying to find someone I could talk to than actually having a conversation. After an hour, I was done. I just couldn't handle it anymore. But I didn't want to be rude and leave without saying anything. I texted my best friend, who happened to be at a nearby bar, and instantly came up with a brilliant excuse. "I'd love to stay," I said loudly, walking up to my friend, "but I just realized I promised my brother I'd help him with something at his place. It's last minute, and he really needs my help." She looked at me sympathetically, and I took that as my cue to slip away. I was out the door in minutes, and instead of going home, I met my friend at the bar. We laughed for hours, reminiscing about the awkwardness I had just escaped. Sometimes you just need to fake a family emergency to save yourself from social exhaustion.